Honorable Vice Chancellor, fellow teachers, guests, and students. What I hope to do this afternoon is to have a brief look at the unique genius that Rabindranath was. He has been called a world poet, and justly so. This is not merely because of his worldwide reputation, but also, and more importantly, on account of his wide view of the world. He took interest in all the affairs of the world. Perhaps there have been greater poets than Rabindranath, but so far as lyrical compositions are concerned, he is the greatest. And no other poet has volunteered to take upon him his own self so many responsibilities, social, political, and literary, as Rabindranath did. His interest in science was deep. He had argued with Einstein in person on the question of reality. True, he was an idealist, but his works indicate that he was a realist too. And it is not without significance that he had sent his son and son-in-law to America for training in agriculture. He had himself confessed that at the beginning his focus was wholly on literature. But there came a moment when he had perforce to snatch himself away and emerge into the stark light of the bare facts of poverty of his people, and that he was rudely shaken out of his dreams. We remember that he had renounced his British knighthood in protest against the massacre perpetrated by the government in India in 1919, and that he had stood almost alone in that protest. Rabindranath had spoken in public meetings, political gatherings, and written continuously against colonialism in India. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature just before the First World War broke. The world was full of anxiety and tension, feeling that a war was imminent. It wanted to listen to a voice speaking of peace and harmony. His Gitanjali did the job. In his songs, Rabindranath had prayed to an invisible power to make it possible for him to wake for him and his country to wake in a heaven where the mind is without fear and the head is high, where knowledge is free and where the world has not broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. His emphasis on fearlessness, dignity, and education, together with unity of the world, was remarkable. Rabindranath's interest in education was unfailing. He had set up an experimental elementary school in a village, which grew into a university, and he called it Vishwabharati, signifying that it was an Indian institution reaching out to the world. His vision was clear and unmistakable. It was during the First World War that he had spoken publicly in his 3 lectures, 2 in America and 1 in Japan, against what he called nationalism. He held it responsible for the menace human beings were encountering in those days. What he had called nationalism was in reality capitalism engaged in imperialist competition for occupation, hiding itself under the cover of nationalism. Rabindranath had called himself a born romantic, and part of his romanticism lay in his unwavering optimism. In his lectures on nationalism, he had reposed his trust in the emerging and unentangled America to provide the world with a new leadership replacing ailing Europe. And he was sadly mistaken. For over the years, America itself turned imperialist, causing much that was not only wrong, but positively evil. To his great disappointment, a Second World War, worse than the first, broke out. And it was only 3 months before his death that he wrote his final testament in the form of an essay called Crisis in Civilization. The war was still raging in full fury, and he spoke of his total loss of faith in Western civilization. And once again, What he was decrying was, in reality, crisis in capitalism. Capital itself had made the world unlivable. He recalled that during his visit to the Soviet Union, he had noticed how a vast country had succeeded in liquidating ignorance and poverty, wiping out humiliation from its face. Rabindranath felt that it was due to a social revolution that the achievement in Soviet Union was possible. He assumed that it was primarily through education that the change came. However, he was unwilling to accept the truth that the transformation was due not so much to education as to a social revolution that abolished private ownership of property. He recommended, in fact, collective action in both agriculture and small-scale industry. But he was not prepared to admit, because of his liberalism, that the idea of total abolition of private ownership. What was particularly remarkable about his final testament was that he was not ready to despair. He said that he would not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in humanity. Rabindranath knew what capitalism was like and has portrayed the horrors of it in his writings. And we remember his Rock to Corby, where the king of the land has become a prisoner of his own material greed and has reduced his country to a veritable slum. The release of the king and the collapse of the system came through the intervention of a rebellious girl who believed in return to agricultural cultivation, rejecting capitalist digging of mines. In another remarkable play, Rathojatra, Rabindranath shows that history in modern times has got stuck and its chariot will not move unless the working class lends its hand to pull it. And with the working class participating, the chariot moves. But Rabindranath forewarns the new leaders that in driving they must maintain a balance, lest the chariot of history should get stuck once again. In both cases, his attitude was liberal, and he certainly was one of the finest representatives of that ideology. Personally, he was deeply influenced by his father, and in his writings, he often speaks of his devotion to a father figure. But he has always been a believer in mother's care and affection. What happened to Gora in the epical novel of that name is indicative of Rabindranath's own anti-patriarchal. He was anti-patriarchal. Gora was at first a liberal. Then he turned into a fundamentalist, Brahmanistic Hindu and tried to establish that system. But at a critical moment, he discovered that far from being a Brahmin, he was not even an Indian by birth, and that his parents were an Irish couple killed at his birth during the Sepoy Revolution. And in discovering that, Gora had a rebirth. And in excitement, when he was reborn, he ran to his foster mother. He draws her feet, lays his hands on his head, and then, as his foster mother kisses him fondly, Gora declares, "Mother, you are my mother. The mother I was in quest of so long. The mother has been here in our own house." Rabindranath was one of us, very near and dear to our heart. He was born into a class at a historical time and was aware of his separation from the peasantry and working class of his country. But he remained a Bengali first and an Indian afterwards, although an internationalist all the time. And it was only natural that we in Bangladesh went to him for providing us with our national anthem, in which the country is portrayed as a mother. Our debt to him is beyond repayment. He has enriched our language, secularized our literature, and given us songs to sing. He taught us that education should be in the mother tongue, and its purpose should not only be to enlighten, but also to connect people with themselves and with nature. Rabindranath hated the separation. Rabindranath wanted politically a separation between the state and society. But that proposition of separation has proved untenable. Nevertheless, we live in society, and society is getting unlivable under the tyranny of capitalism in its vilest form of operation. Rabindranath was a humanist, and today it is not only humanism, but human beings themselves are struggling for survival. What we need is a new cultural regeneration, a regeneration of togetherness all over the world, built on social ownership of resources. And in that striving, Rabindranath will be always with us, telling us not to despair. To be sure, we cannot do without Rabindranath. Thank you.